Welcome to Quarantine Talks from the Kitchen Summer Edition. Mira Henry, who all you know, will be the first one. It has a subtitle of Thesis and Beyond. This is not to make it exclusive for thesis students or for postgrad or for anybody. But the idea is a little bit, and I will say Mira is our first speaker in the summer, but and also is the only known alum that we have lined up for you guys in the summer. So technically, her talk is not really based on her thesis, but this came about in a series of, we've been talking with Mira a lot recently, and one of the conversations, it was an interesting thing, was to revisit the installation that Mira did not that long ago in our gallery, which I think she did a really great conversation with David Eskenazi, I remember. But it was, I think it was interesting to revisit some of the concepts, and I don't know what else you will show. So in a way, I know it's not your thesis, it was a gallery installation, but I would argue that many of the gallery installations are almost like a reboot of thesis later in all of us careers. So I always think that the architecture installation becomes a little bit like laboratories in which we can trigger some of our with more clarity certain ideas. I don't know, you'll tell me, and we will see if that's something that it relates to the issue. But as I said, everybody knows Mira Henry is a faculty here in the school, now practicing together with Matthew Au. So the goal of this, Mira, as we talk about it, is you speak for as long as you want, but also then we have, after that, we have a conversation, and sometimes people use the chat, sometimes they ask directly. So either you can read from the chat, or I'm happy to read for everybody the questions, but that comes after. And usually it becomes a super interesting follow-up conversation. So without further ado, Mira, the screen is all yours.
Cool.
Thank you for doing this. It's fantastic that you get us going in the summer.
Hernán, thank you. Thank you for having me. Well, yeah, I mean, I actually, I did Rough Coat 9 years, 8 years after I graduated with my master's. And I don't think that I realized how like completely related it was to the work I did in my final year of grad school. I mean, so much so it's almost embarrassing. And I really like went in like full on, like kind of not really registering that. And it wasn't until after I mounted the show, I invited a lot of people to come in because the show was, that work was so fresh. And so sort of, there was a lot of instinct and a sort of kind of risk that was involved in that work. And so there was not a lot of distance I felt from the work. And so after I set up the show, I invited a lot of people to come and be in the space with me. And I'm going to show some images of the work and all of that. But one of the people I had come was Jason Payne, who was my one of the faculty that I think shaped me the most when I was a graduate student. And we laughed and cried a little too, actually, because the work was so such a sort of powerful extension of some kind of seeds, not just seeds, like some very specific interests that I had when I was a grad student. So that was like really cool. So just on the topic of thesis and beyond, I think we hit it right there. I'm going to show my screen. Bear with me a little bit because it has been a really full time right now. And so I always like whenever invited to speak to kind of keep things a little fresh and to not just kind of rehearse the normal things. So I didn't kind of pull from an old lecture. I just kind of decided to put some new stuff together with really with the specific intention of talking about some of the B-sides of Rough Coat, and also specifically this format and this idea of the kitchen talk. And I love that title. I love the intimacy of that. I think that this kind of radical collapse between our public selves and the privacy of our homes is our reality right now, and also a pretty kind of relevant thematic in the work that that I do, and the way that I think about some things that just fuel my sort of architectural imagination, I guess I would say. And so, but I wanted to start with, so to talk about the kitchen table and talk about kitchen talks and kitchen, this idea and this framework. I wanted to start with this kind of seminal body of work by this woman who's a photographer, artist named Carrie Mae Weems. And she did this series called the Kitchen Table Series in 1990. And there were 20 photographs, all black and white. You can see them here laid out, all square format, and interspersed with these pieces of text. Usually when they were either in book format or shown in a gallery, they're always shown also with some kind of narrative text. And the photographs she did early on in her career, and it was also sort of this breakout moment for her. She says that these photographs were, people asked, you know, she is the story, a sort of narrative of a woman in a room, a woman in and surrounded by things, by her furniture, by the components of the room, by other people, other stuff, you know, books, drinks, attitudes, performances, emotions, tension, love. There's all of it there. I love the photographs because they sit in a very strange place to me, because if you look at, most of the photographs are actually situated where she's sitting down and she's at the head of the table or at the end of the table, so to speak, depending on the point of view. And the camera view is high. It's like the photograph is of the room. It's not so much of the people. And the people happen to be in that room, and the life of that room and the people themselves kind of begin to commingle. And when you get to a photograph like this, where she actually has to stand up to actually face the camera, be eye to eye the camera, you get a sense of how high that camera actually is, that point of view. For many reasons, I love these, and the intimacy and the humor of these. And I actually saw, there's an art collector here in LA, went to her house, and she has some of these, some of the small original prints, and they just are so beautiful and powerful. So when we talk about a kitchen talks, I can't help but not think of Carrie Mae Weems and this series of kitchen table talks, kitchen table series, let's say. There is also a point where if you think from an architectural perspective that these are somehow photographs and portraits, not just of a person, but of a whole space, then it becomes, maybe puts pressure a bit on some architectural questions that I really have, I think are, which I love, which are the way in which people occupy space, the performance of bodies, the kind of intermixing between objects and human activity, and this architecture as a container. All those things start to kind of blend in some way in these photographs. And I think that blending is between let's say, subjectivity, life, like liveness, and an architecture. The body of an architecture and the bodies in the architecture are things that I have begun to realize are really kind of central to my thinking. This came out of, I would say, Rough Coat really helped me actually figure that out, and I'll kind of talk about that. Yeah, these are some more of those. This is a different kitchen table. This is the kitchen table that a painting, a very bleached out painting that is in the kitchen at my grandma's house. And there's lots of water stains on the glass and it's all bleached out. But I've looked at this for very many years. And so when I decided that I was going to take on the thematic at the beginning of it, I was like, I'm going to talk about the kitchen table. I want to talk about kitchen. I want to talk about that. I called my grandma and I said, can you send me a picture of that one photograph of the ladies at the kitchen table and tell me about it? This is my grandma. My grandma's 95. This was a picture of us last year. So my grandma sent me this photograph. It was really warped. She took it with her phone. And so I unwarped it. And she told me, she said so her friend Helen gave her that photograph, the painting rather, because she knew that my grandmother loved bridge and these ladies were playing bridge. And she said, but the reason she also liked it was because it reminded her of the kitchen table that she sat at in St. Louis with her mama and her sister, Vivian. And so she said that whenever she looks at that, she makes her want to laugh. So I think that there's a lot of power in the kitchen and in the kitchen table and the sort of lives that we live in them. And that to me is also a part of architecture. Yeah, so that's my grandma. This is my grandmother. So that was her at 95. This is her at 95. This is her when she was in her early 20s. She is a librarian and was the head librarian at Bennett College. She's just very powerful and influential woman in my life. This is a photograph of the house 15 years later that she and my grandfather had built. And this is in Seattle, in the Uplands neighborhood in Seward Park in Seattle. And this, it was designed by an architect named Benjamin McAdoo, who was the first Black architect in Seattle to have his own practice. And this building and this house is actually a historic site because it was also the first Black-owned house in this neighborhood. So it was the kind of precedent for producing a certain amount of integration in that neighborhood. And so when my grandparents bought the property in 1959, they had to do so through a third party, a white individual who they paid handsomely to purchase the land for them on their behalf. And then they hired Benjamin McAdoo to design the house and build it. And when they moved in, when the neighbors realized who was moving in, it was very complicated and they were threatened. But they ended up being defended by the city, and so they lived there. And this is where my father grew up. This is a picture of Benjamin McAdoo, the architect. So I thought that it would be nice to start here at the house, somewhere that I don't usually start in some ways, but when I began to work leading up to the work I did for Rough Coat, I had been working kind of exclusively on thinking about houses. And so the thing that this idea that Carrie Mae Weems had suggested in her photographs, and I'm not sure if I said this, but I think it's quite resonant, which is that she said when she started working on her photographs, she just worked with what was in front of her. So that she was the model because it was her. The kitchen table was her kitchen. She just had people come. Some of them she knew, some of them she didn't know who posed for the photographs. Some of them she's still friends with, some of them she lost touch with. And I think that it's kind of immediacy of just working with what's in front of you is I would say is similar to the way that I think that I've begun to work as well. So these photographs are of houses that are in my neighborhood. I took these about 3-4 years ago. And I started to catalog houses, houses that I thought were beautiful and strange and had too many layers. So people who know me know that I talk about these houses all the time, so I'm not going to bore y'all, but it is the sort of thing that was germinating in my mind when I started to work on Ref Code. And then now I would say has become a bit more specific in terms of material studies and color studies and things that Matthew and I, for current interests, have also continued to work on, looking at houses, looking at how glass is treated, and how, in this case, deeply tinted, other times foiled. But nonetheless, this idea of a sort of simultaneously a sort of like radical expression of some sort of style, some sort of sense of like that somebody lives here, and yet also a sort of denial of of not being able to see inside. And I think that what I describe as sort of the aesthetics of privacy is at play. Let's say is something that I'm reading in these. And my friend and Kati Barkin, who's also in LA, who's over at UCLA, she and I talk about a text by Bell Hooks called Home Place, A Site of Resistance. And Bell Hooks wrote this piece talking about the way in which Black female subjectivity is that the site of the interior of the house is a site of where the sense of self can be constructed when the outside world is hostile. And that piece is a really beautiful piece. It's a very short piece if anybody wants to read Bell Hooks, and talks about the sort of interior as a place of power. And I guess I would say that, and I don't say that necessarily to imply that I want to be clear that like it's not, I don't know that like I know who lives here, I know who lives in these places. And it's not necessarily my lived experience, but nonetheless there's a sort of sensation and maybe sort of an overlay of a reading about the sort of necessity for privacy, that, and then also all of the kind of material articulations that come with that. The shrubbery, the blinds, the cladding, the color, the bars, the blinds, the eaves, I mean, there are many layers. And then this is just like shameless plug. This was, I just finished writing a piece in the new log, like log 48. I did it with John Cooper. We wrote about a sort of, it's called a curly crown, a conversation in motion, I think is what we called it. But it's actually about this building here, which is quite near where all of these houses are located. This is in South Los Angeles, and this is in Jefferson Park neighborhood. And so we write about a sort of dialogue back and forth about the history of this particular building, which is was historically a bank, which was built in 1928. So if you'll want to read it, you should check it out. It's in the log. But and I'm not exactly sure how to like make the turn to RefCo, but I could say that probably it's quite clear to move from these houses. When I was invited to work on RefCo, I was looking at this work and I was trying these houses, and I was trying to think about how to move some of the sensibility of this kind of like layered, and kind of self-made cladding, kind of layers of the exterior, could somehow move into the gallery space, move into the interior. And so to me, I like setting up these two photographs next to one another. On the left is one of those homes, and on the right is a stunning painting by Carrie James Marshall called Nude Spotlight. and it juxtaposed this sort of, and I didn't have these in my head when I did the show. It was only after the fact that I began to sort of put together the narrative. But when I started working on Rough Coat, the idea was to kind of think about how the exterior, this idea of something quite building scale, could get move through something that is at a very different scale. The idea of the blanket, or something interior, something very flexible and provisional. So what I wrote in for Rough Coat, what I wrote on that wall, I think it's still kind of still true. I said Rough Coat is the story of constructing a monumental blanket. Blankets, as we know, are soft, they're submissive, and they're tolerant. They're inviting to use and easy to put away. The monumental suggests something far more weighty, heroic, and labored. Out of this setup comes a certain range of performances. There are parts that behave well, parts that behave badly, and parts that act in a manner we may not quite recognize. The gallery in this context becomes a permissive space in which issues of color, tactility, tectonics, the body, labor, and the city are allowed to overlap and cohabitate. The project is not about constructing distance such that all things that therefore come into focus. This stuff wants us close. So oftentimes when I talk about this project, sometimes people ask, why do you only, I don't usually read that little blurb, but most of the photographs I show of this work is quite up close, because I think there is a sort of, well, many of you guys had seen the work. It's really about a sort of tactility, and also about the kind of space making around the pieces, right? There's an object and a series of objects, but there's also the constructing of the environment, right? So this idea of painting the space completely dark in order for these forms, these bodies, to be able to find themselves in a natural setting. That felt important to me. Again, the sort of on the right, the kind of the darkness of an interior, the intimacy of something like blankets, somehow up against the layered and sort of defense of an exterior. So to make this piece, we took over like 4 bays of SCI-Arc for the course of, I don't know, we actually had I think a 6-week design research, material research session. I did this with like about 5 students. And then we had a 15-day production cycle a bit later in the summer. And so we got an industrial sewing machine, and all of this, the first 6 weeks was actually to come up with a prototype of an idea of a panel that could come together and that could somehow bring the flexibility of a blanket to stucco-based material application. So we were working with an elastomeric stucco that was super flexible. And so it was super intense, and we learned so much together. And the students, many of the students are probably on this call. I don't usually show this side of the project, but I thought this would be a perfect time to show the kind of working space of this project. It was very, the students were kind of ran the show, and it was really fun and stressful and funny, and a delight, because we didn't really know what we were making. I mean, we knew, but we didn't really know. We were like, there was no map yet. We just knew that we were going to work on this building size blanket. That was the idea. And yes, Mira, we'll trust you. We will do it. And we will make we will construct this new idea of this material, spackling foam, upholstery foam, and stuccoing upholstery foam, and color dipping and dyeing in order to produce something that would not look like something that you knew before, something that somehow hovered between something that was recognizable, but also very hard to pinpoint. I think that was really something that we were looking at. And we were making those decisions together. Touch up my face, spackle my back, 2 coats and my back, 3 coats and my back. This was just some of the things that were in play in the working hours of our production. And the kind of care that that came out of this collective was insane. And it was really quite cool. Kendall's up there, I think you can kind of see, and then somebody else's feet are down below. And I think that there is a sort of, I don't want to necessarily call it low tech, but there is a sort of, the immediacy of the process of working was super important, I think, to me. And it was definitely something that was embraced by the student collective, of just how to work in a way where the stuff in front of us was giving our feedback. And I was a sort of, I would say maybe slightly cathartic, a sort of like collapse between the working space of an architecture, which always seems to have a bit of distance, and the stuff itself. So also the scale of it was quite important. So ourselves and our bodies were in this work, and consciously and subconsciously, I think. And the performance of it was like a sort of performance. The whole thing was a sort of performance, and that we were just trying to get through, let's say. Let's see, it's kind of stopped for a second. There we go. So this is one life of the project, the life of the production. Another life of the project was the life of it once it was installed. And I don't have photographs. I know that I have them somewhere, but I wasn't quite able to get it together to bring them here, or video of the show, the exhibition itself. That night was like the kind of idea of their performance felt really important to me, that we would bring music in and people could drink inside the space and eat inside the space, and that there was a sort of a sense of being in a moment felt important, and like I'm going to take up some space here today, folks, and it was a sort of celebration that was pretty cool. And so there was that life, the life of the night itself, and then there was a life after, which was how to document it. And we did have the photographer for the school, Josh White, photograph it, and I have those, and they're very high resolution. They're very beautiful. And it was a conversation Matthew and I were having, where I realized that the work itself, the work didn't make sense to me unless there was people in the pictures. And so I invited a portrait photographer to come to the space, and she took medium format film images, and we basically I invited the people who built the work, so the students who who made it. I also invited friends and people who had families, friends of mine and their whole family came. So I wanted people to come and just be in the space, and we listened to music and we took photographs. So it was kind of like a quasi happening thing, but it was, it was a way somehow to just try and kind of document some merging between the work and which has its own, let's say, aesthetic preoccupation, and a sort of relationship to how it gets used. This idea that somehow maybe this idea that a cladding could be like a sort of like a hoodie or something that you could just kind of move and put on, the sort of work and play and rest also of the work felt like we were able to try and capture that. And one of the things that was really beautiful was because of the way the walls were painted and the way that the room was lit, you're really able to see a sort of kind of fugitive nature of color. Like you have some of these photographs and you can see are like soaked in green, and others are like really these just like really kind of earth and like body tones, depending on where you look. That wall beyond sometimes is purple brown, sometimes is green, and I think that that was something that we're also looking at. And so I think that there was a sort of object lesson in this work where I was also trying to figure out, like, put my finger on where all the architecture was. The architecture was in all of these things. The architecture was in the idea of the tectonics. Architecture was an idea of trying to construct a sort of new materiality. The architecture was an idea about people in a space, about people working on something together, about the lighting, and about the sort of performance. So those things were all suddenly kind of began to unfold as the very subject of the work. And so I'll just show you a couple more photographs of those moments. I think that's, I don't know who's under there. I think that's Dutra with the legs. I don't know who that is. It might be Mateos. I'm not quite sure. I know that's Mateos. And I mean, just as a sort of PS, this was 2 years ago, and Matt and I have since worked on several projects that are moving kind of many of the thematics and kind of aesthetics into other built forms. A house that we've designed for in Echo Park that took on quite literally the idea. This is actually an artist studio. This idea of the insulation blanket and as a sort of performative blind, like a blind, and some full-scale mock-ups. So there is kind of life, there has been life in the last quite a few sort of versions in the last couple of years. But I think I'll end here in the sort of quietness of the space. And that's it.
Thank you, Mira. Fantastic. Super interesting to go back and revisit and hear. Maybe to get us going, and then other people can ask and so on. But I want to go back a little bit to the Carrie May pictures that you were talking, which I think they're fascinating.
Carrie May Weems, yeah.
Yeah, no, but in relation to the installation, in the relation of the way of the idea of framing and the idea of flattening. So there was, I would argue, one of the interesting things from my point of view about the idea of the textile and the puffy textile is it's almost impossible to flat, even if it's a 2D photography and so on. There will be something about that. So there is something about the Carrie May pictures in the way the perspective with the table that always reinforce certain things, which is about the relation between the flatness of a photography, but try to understand the three-dimensionality. And at least the pictures that you're showing today, which I think they're, as you said, fundamentally different. If you were showing Joshua White pictures, which you will have different kind of life. There is some relation about that and also the idea to elevate domesticity or to elevate the day by day. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about that, because I'm very intrigued by that relationship.
I wonder whether those two things have a sort of relationship, but they're definitely, I mean, elevating the quotidian, elevating the everyday is central to it's like the itch that you can't stop scratching or something. It's like the thing that I'll probably be working on for a very, very long time. And I could speak about that kind of in on multiple levels. One is certainly a political one, a sort of gentle political, which is like and like starting with the thing that's in front of you. A sort of resistance maybe to always starting maybe so very far away or so very lofty, So there is a sort of, I think, history of like starting with what is in front of you, for sure. And I feel like it wasn't something that I learned. It was a sort of a choice. It was a sort of choice, not when I was in grad school. It was a sort of choice when I started to figure out what does it mean for me to actually produce my own voice and produce my own body of work. It was also precisely the moment where we were kind of all collectively really double downing on thinking through precedent and thinking through the sort of kind of return to the disciplinary at that moment in like 2015, 2016. And so for me to say, I'm going to look at the like my table. I did a sort of study of like a tablecloth, and the house across the street felt like a sort of choice. It wasn't necessarily I don't think it needs to always be understood in a reactionary sense, but I think probably initially it maybe was. But there's also a sort of there's also the sort of building convention piece, which I'm finding, and is a conversation Matthew and I are having quite a bit, which is something that we're really double downing on, like thinking about constantly now, like as we are moving much more aggressively into building, is how to a way to do work that is produces unfamiliarity, but starting with some sort of convention so that you can actually get into the game, working with people that have a sort of trade understanding, like I understand stucco, I understand how to, construct certain metal framing in a certain way. I understand lap shingling in a certain way, but then to sort of kind of hack it has been also a way for us to like work in a way where we think we could actually scale, like be able to scale. So there's also something strategic. We realize now there's a sort of aesthetic appreciation, but there's also a sort of just a strategy there too, in how to move and kind of scale up because I think we are interested in continuing to build. Excuse me. So there is that.
The other one I have for now, and hopefully other people will jump in. This is a little bit more personal, Mira. I want to know if you ever managed to be in your grandparents' house, the McAdoo house.
Oh, I love that house. Oh yeah. Oh my God, it's a beautiful house. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
I wonder how much
you think influenced you ending being an architect or not.
Well,
people don't know, this is a very famous house in Seattle.
Yeah,
Very famous house.
Interestingly,
Google it. I mean, you will see it in, I don't know how many pictures appear. It's a famous house.
I mean, interestingly, my mother's family, who lived just the neighborhood over, Jewish family, they also bought land and built a house almost the same year, and a mid-century home also. So it was that era. It was the era. And so both of my grandparents lived in these like kind of amazing mid-century homes, and my parents grew up. And so there's like, I for sure think that's lodged. I mean, I for sure is lodged. I also like most of the furniture in my house has been like scavenged from all of that too. But yeah. And my uncle also on my father's side my great uncle was an architectural engineer, and he passed away last year, but he did some really amazing structures in in Louisiana, in St. Louis. And I had a chance to visit them also this past year when he passed away, and they're dope. They're these amazing roof structures. So I think that it's kind of been around, although not so like pointed. That's not, it's been around, and it's been around my environment.
Yeah. Anybody want to ask? You can write the chat. Christina, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Hi, Mira. Great lecture. Thank you so much. I'm kind of shamelessly asking a question that is something that I've been kicking around for thesis, and I'm really curious to hear what you've been thinking about it. The relationship between a kind of soft object and as structure, and what you were thinking about, like how you went and designed something that's going to be supporting something else, and the relationship between the idea of like the architectural structure and then the kind of addition, the decoration or what have you.
Yeah. Well, I think that there are, I think there were certain things, simply because this project, Rough Coat, was, you know, it had to be sort of concise. There was a sort of, I privileged working on the soft structure, and therefore and that in itself had almost all the integrity, and that was where all the effort was. And there was a sort of purposeful, I don't know, banality, I think, to the thing that was that carried it. Like it was just like minimum condition. Like the blankets, the horizontal green blankets were all just on top of the crates that packed all the material up. And then the kind of just this kind of very, very simple frame that carried this thing was kind of like super thin. So I think that and when I was working on it, at some point we started to bend some of the metal to sort of like start to begin a dialogue between the structure and the object itself. But I don't, and I think that was a kind of, that could have been the next level, is starting to think about the sort of relationship between those things. But I don't think that it really even needed that, honestly. But that's just the nature of this particular project. I think that thinking about, thinking about the sort of, I would say like performance, or I like to think about it as like almost like sympathy between the two actors, is a really beautiful sort of subject. So I think that they're like characters, right? That, you know, it's the way I would imagine, I kind of think about it. So I don't know whether or not, I think that how you tune them, who speaks louder, is just your own kind of research. Yeah.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Who else? I have other questions if nobody has them, but I want everybody else to engage.
Mm.
Okay, so while we wait for other people,
Yeah.
One thing that honestly, Mira, never occurred to me until you mentioned at the beginning of your talk. I think another, maybe down the road, we should have another conversation again about this installation, talk with Jason about Strawberry Fields, the installation that he did in SCI-Arc.
Totally.
Because I was thinking about the size of panels and the softness and the movement.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, they're not even close. They don't look alike, nothing. But there is a very strange between line conversation to be had, which honestly, I never put it together until you mentioned today that thing with Jason. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that, because I always intrigued by those distant dialogues that sometimes things are happening without any of us reading. So I don't know, there was something about Strawberry Fields and yours that somehow there is a kind of a conversation there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I actually wasn't in LA when he built that. Some friends of mine, though, helped him fabricate it. I know the project really, really well. And it was such a seminal project for him. It was such a beautiful project. And I think that part of what I love about that project, and I think there's definitely a lineage. I think there's a lineage, not a sort of, I think a sort of paternal one, but nonetheless a sort of like being at, I find that I like where you're at the same table with somebody somehow, even though he's, you know, I think that there is a sort of an affection between the projects. And simply also because it takes on the sort of building component, right? It's like the roof, you know, the facade, you know, and yet, and they're kind of, they don't work so well, you know, and they're kind of excessive, and but they're still like kind of like kind of fall back on a sort of vernacular, almost like sincerity or something. I'm not sure, a sort of familiar, you know.
Yeah.
So I think that there's that also, you know, without being like, you know, I don't, I mean that this, I mean it like, it's not, you know, without it being like a semiotic thing or something like that, but it's yeah.
We have a question in the chat from Richard, Mira, for you. He says, "Hi, Mira. Thanks for the lecture. I have a growing appreciation and interest in the personal, in quotes, which you mentioned. As you lecture on these projects and your work, do you ever find resistance from certain people within the discipline on working on the personal? How do you respond to that? And how do you keep a strong hold in your voice in architectural academia?"
I don't really think I get resistance. I think the resistance comes from myself. I mean, I think that one's own, like, I mean, that's not true. I was, our dear friend, I don't know if I'm going to call it out as it, but I did get a really interesting comment when I was at OSU last year about like the need to tell the story. You have so many, why can't the work speak for itself? Why must there need to be this kind of narrative? Why the narrative overlay? Why the showing of and almost like, are you becoming too didactic? Like that this this relates to this. Why so much narrative in the work when I speak about it, right? The work itself is the work, but why when present is it so so very thick with the personal? I think that's that, and because at that point, aren't you undermining the work itself? And to that, I responded, well, when am I going to tell you all about the other things on my mind? If not in the format of a lecture. Of course, the work stands for itself. And also, like, there's like, when else am I going to say all the other things? Because I think that, you know, the building construct can only do so much, right? So to deny our ability to overlay and underlay the like other layers of meaning and history, and to take advantage of that as a way of amplifying, thickening, making more complex, making more challenging the subjects at hand. I think that I feel like why not? So Richard, without maybe being, I hope that kind of gets at maybe the edges of what you may be asking, which is that maybe I think like that in what way, what are the ways in which that sense of the personal are delivered? Is it in the content itself, or is it also come in other ways in which the work is formatted? Is because I would say I'm a bit more on that side. Like, I think that there are many ways one can engage the work on the work that I do, but I also really and that's why I think that if I had the time, I think I would spend a lot more time writing, because I think that's where you can actually, for me, I feel the most comfortable being able to unpack some of that and to allow some of the other layers of my thoughts to be able to sit alongside the kind of aesthetics of the work.
I will say in relation to that, Mira, which I think Richard's question is an interesting and important one, is by now, I think we all have come to terms with anything that we look at it, work of architecture, work of art, music, is filtered by the narrative, or is filtered by, I mean, I can give you a very, and this is something that actually David Rue says all the time. It's like there will be no wine industry without wine criticism. Like you're influenced by what you're drinking for what because what you wrote, for example. So I think that that's one of the I don't know. It's kind of an absurd preconception that the idea that the word should stand by itself. Yes, of course, but we know that everything is layered and filtered through different way of that construction, and there's no other way. And also, by the way, in the specific case of a lecture, I mean that's what they invite you for, right? Is to tell behind the curtain the story, what's in your head, what are the stories that we all construct, right? So I don't know. I always found that when people ask those questions in lecture, kind of peculiar. It's not that the purpose of this, that we sharing narratives. And anyway, hold on. Let's see. We have something in the chat. Oh, Richard was just saying that his mic broke halfway through the day, so I can jump in, but that was very helpful. So he thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that obviously there's also the point, which is that, like, I think that there is personal in almost everybody's work. It's just the question of whether or not that personal is somehow very comfortable and easy and known versus one that is maybe less so, And so I would say, like, I think that that's a sort of maybe slightly different conversation about universalisms and ideas about the universal.
Yeah. If anybody have any other question, please jump ahead, write it. I have one on my end. I have one more, and it's kind of a simple one, but I'm very curious about the puffiness on the fabric. What is the, I don't know, obsession is the word, but the recurrency to keep going back to that puffiness, because I find that this is a super interesting aspect of it, because it's not only in installation. I saw in some of the quick thing that you show, the things that you're working with Matthew, that it seems to keep reappearing.
Yep.
And it seems very powerful.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I think maybe it's also because it's like what's in the sandwich of a building, but never really always exposed, or it's like what's it's what's in the room, but not maybe on the wall. I mean, it's like there we could talk about ideas of comfort, right? Like the comfort of like padding and upholstery and all that. And I think that I also see this as also like almost like a super, like it's also like a bulletproof vest. This thing too is also comfy, but also not so comfy. It's also like a little like really like it starts to ping in terms of its relationality to many things that move from the building to something more like a garment and the fullness of a body without actually becoming a geometric exercise. And I think that is something that, and maybe gets back to this frontality question and the sort of flatness versus three-dimensional piece, which is that I think that and also the kind of quick question to Christina about like the tuning. I think that right now my focus is, and the conversation Matthew and I both have together, is how to withhold certain geometric expressionism in order for these other sort of kind of material qualities to start to produce the kind of three-dimensional effect. And so yeah, flat but full, not graphic, but nonetheless framed, sort of almost orthographic, but nonetheless like full and almost resistant to that. Feel like they're a sort of it's kind of a calibration of that right now.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Who else?
Mira, hi.
Hi. My friend Jackie.
I wanted to expand upon what you were just saying, because maybe I never really told you what my reading was of that project.
Yeah.
But I always thought of that project as a kind of dampener, like dampening of figure, dampening of aesthetics, and a kind of dampening of color. And I wonder what you think about that, because I mean, is it a kind of reaction to something?
I think so. But also dampening of like sound and dampening of dampening
exactly.
of like physical like impact, dampening of many things, right? I mean, dampening of visibility, like a sort of dampening of many things. I think it has to do with control.
Well, I think that the project produces a kind of different like consciousness about color and form and all the things that we look at and find beautiful or not beautiful. And it produces a whole different kind of effect, right? And I think that your work and, you know, your work with Matthew and David Eskenazi's work and Anna's work have a similar tone in that way. And I just wonder if it's a conscious kind of reaction to the more delineated and figural and absolute in a way.
Yeah, I mean, I think it has a lot to do with also a sort of tone of like seeing and sensing. And I think that that's where, like, looking back at some of the, like, studying houses and studying existing buildings come into play, because it's about making architecture, but also that making of architecture comes out of seeing architecture in a very like the way in which, like, where you rest your eyes and how you see that. Like, sometimes things you have to look at slowly and over time, and watch as it accumulates dust, and watch as it's like there. So like, if you read the piece I wrote for Log, it's very much about that, the sort of like life of almost stoic, stagnant edifice on the corner of a street in LA, like the kind of mute but full and nonetheless a kind of expressive entity that seems to be present on that street corner. So I think it's also like how to a sort of you know, a way of like making some space for something a little bit quieter to somehow be seen as powerful. I think this is maybe it's a little too like esoteric or something, but that's one of the things I really started to enjoy about how seeing architecture in other ways, and like thinking about who made the building the way it is. You know, it was designed at one point and it existed, but the identity of a building in a place is an accumulation of many lives and many events, and trying to be able to read and sense that it works at a different time scale. And I think, and also like, so I think that maybe there's a sort of restraint, I think. And so trying to figure out how to make work that maybe carries some of that potency.
Hi, Mira.
Thank you.
Anya.
I love when Jackie said that it's a kind of dampening, because it reminded me of my frantic phone call to you when I was doing my version of a house to say, Mira, you've done this amazing thing, you have to help me. And all along you were super supportive. And then there was one moment where I asked, what the fuck did you do about the lights? Because they were so bright, and you kind of gave me a tutorial on gels and how you used like 40 layers of gels just to lower the brightness in the room. And what I realize now, just seeing kind of the project again and hearing you speak a little bit about bringing in another set of photographers to kind of take a much more tactile approach to the work, I realized that the whole thing is a kind of stage set for these photographers to come in and to bring in this narrative back into the work. Because I think when it sits in the gallery as an object, we miss out on the fact that there are Black bodies building and touching, and there is that interface of what Hernán is calling the puffy and the brown material against the hand that's kind of squeezing it. And it's like, those pictures are so astonishing. And I think that that's where the project really kind of came to its fruition. And I hope, I don't know, Log probably is like a black and white little journal, but I hope that you find a beautiful, shiny publication where you can actually kind of publish these gorgeous photographs, because it's exactly in the texture and the kind of low contrast of all of the lighting and the dampening of sound, etc. That, like, sound, of course, we can't hear here, but where this begins to be visible, the project begins to be visible. So it's quite an amazing, like, it's such an achievement against some of the noise of the high contrast kind of works, especially just the kind of the blown out stuff that we might get out of just working in the computer itself, but like really working with these materials and seeing them up close and personal like this is really beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you. And to be continued, because look at that.
I mean, like, you know, I think that I loved I loved this project because I learned a lot with this project. I learned a lot about what mattered to me, and it didn't happen in the conception. It happened at the beginning. It happened during. It happened after, and it continues to kind of unfold. And I think that is I think that work where I think that and that is nice, sure, but also that that we can participate in building up a sense of what can be an architectural question. Feels really important, especially now. You know, that an architectural question isn't just necessarily only in the conceptual design phase or whatever it is, but like it can happen in all these places. And again, I go back to the way in which I think that has so much to do with just also how you see architecture in the world and how you sense it. And why I would say, going back to Carrie Mae Weems and those beautiful photographs, why those are amazing portraits of architecture. And for us to kind of, I like to hold that.
Okay, maybe one more, Mira. Oh, we have one.
As it gets dark in my room.
Yeah, we got one from the chat from Zoe Maleki. Mira, what is the text that you mentioned about the interior as a place of power?
The bell hook.
I would love to read it.
I'm gonna write it. Well, I can't write it. I don't know. I can't. Oh, chat. I can write it. Well, it's Bell Hooks' home place. Bell Hooks is the author, and the text is called Home Place, in parentheses, a site of resistance. But I mean, I can send it out. You know, I don't know how to type it in the thingy, but yeah, I have it. I can forward it to you.
I just have one small question. Hi, Mira.
Is that Florencia?
Yes. within the context, a long day today. Thank you so much. I think that within the context of thesis and all the thesis students that I'm seeing here, I mean, I think that this is a thesis. I mean, you know, just to put it, you know, simply. And so I think that if for students that have to ask, you know, what is a thesis? How do I test the thesis? How do we argue for it? You know, I think this was a great presentation just to argue for that. Not that they're going to be here in 3 months, but they will work on it. I just wanted to say one simple thing. I love that, you know, that there's a photographer. That's great that you put that photo, but that you choose a portrait photographer to do the photos. Almost as if, you know, it's not just a photographer, it's not just a photography, but it's a portrait photographer. So I love that specificity, and I wish that everybody sees that you have to go to even that small detail, that, you know, maybe the portrait photographer, you know, it's not about humans, because you can imagine portrait photographer, you need the humans, you had them, but so your architecture or your design becomes the background. But somehow it got foregrounded, you know, because of textures, you know, almost as if you, like in the Marshall paintings, you could cut them out and they become cutouts, humans, I mean, become cutouts, and then the background becomes the foreground. So I thought that was, I didn't know that, I hadn't seen that. I saw the exhibit, but I never saw the photograph. So I just wanted to say how, that I found that quite, you know, poetic, I would say. So I think that you talk about the everyday, the banal houses and so on. And I mean, and there's so much poetics that comes to the foreground. I mean, it seems that it's the background, but it's in the foreground.
Yeah. Thank you, Florencia. Yes.
Okay, if there is not any last question, I think it's 8:12.
I can ask one. Can you get
yes,
two from one channel?
Yeah, absolutely.
One?
Hey, Michael.
Yeah, you guys are economizing bandwidth.
Yeah, that's right, bandwidth.
Yeah.
It's about repression. So, but that's the key word, and especially like about the garment. The garment as a form of hiding something that accentuates it. Like a repression, somehow, it's also like when it's something that I hadn't realized in a way. Like Los is about mastering the art of poker face, right? So you don't really know what's going on inside. So modernism is about repression that ends in a kind of nothing. But what about repression that ends in titillation, if you may? Like,
well, yeah, isn't that what the excess is about? The sort of
right.
excessive outside of these little houses is like excessive. It's excessive. It's like it ends in a sort of excess, and it ends in like swag, and ends in like beauty, like, you know what I mean? Like it ends in like style, you know, and also nope.
Right. No.
Nope.
I always thought of, sorry for the Catholics, but I've always thought about Catholicism as that form of sexy repression. Sorry.
I don't know how you can put sexy in Catholicism, but okay.
Like,
I think it's just repression.
Hiding
just repression.
Frequency.
Just repression, Michael.
Imposter here. But like,
this
there's
is a
something.
fun conversation. We should do this all the time.
Yeah.
I told you that these lectures take a whole other dimension in the Q&A.
No, there's something about the that, and it's actually different than the image of mid-century. There's something, I feel like, so I'm actually trying to make a comment about contemporary forms of exhibitionism that master the art of repression. And I'm in a way thinking about a change from the early 20th century that for repression ended in a question mark, which was open-ended and universal, as opposed to a repression that ends with a very specific set of audiences, like are solicitous. They're it's a repression that's looking for like-minded repressions, I suppose. There's something about the garment as a very different form of interaction, one of anonymity. And it just struck me when you kept saying the garment, and I thought, like, for the early 20th century, that was a mastering the art of anonymity, and there's something about its change 100 years later.
Right.
You know, it's like,
yeah.
it's like a little bit of an area code or something, like you're in my neighborhood or something, you know?
Right, sort of signaling.
Yeah. Anyway.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, yes, I know what you mean. And like on a side thing, which is that, and to the student who just wants to read the bell hooks, I would also try and read the Diana Harris's Little White House at the same time. She writes about 1950s practices of fitting in the American suburban house construct, and the kind of racialization that takes place in form and material and practice of code and rules and things like this. And that next to the bell hooks is very interesting, because the Diana Harris is talking about a sort of transparency. So this is different than the modernism of Los, but the modernism of transparency, that one can have a sort of smooth space between the inside and the outside, the public and the it's like one is, it's a sort of, it's like a sort of like almost like the kind of this, you are this, the, I don't know, there is a that the consumerism of the world is in your house and you are all the same. It's everything becomes the same, versus the house, which is totally private and totally protective and only exists as an interior to construct a important like construction of oneself when the outside is seen as hostile. So those two things would sit alongside that, maybe as friends of maybe that comment, not as an answer to, but maybe alongside that, I think, Michael.
Okay, after repression, it's hard to follow that. Well, Mira, thank you. This was great. It was great to start the summer lecture series with you speaking. Also, I think it's an interesting format to repeat about getting people who have done installation in the gallery to go back and revisit and talk again about it. So I think there is something cool about that. So anyway, Mira, thank you so much. This was great. We will continue. Next Wednesday is Gordon Keeping, class of 95, who will be talking here. And we, as I said, Mira is the only non-alum of this series. For the next 4 or 5 that we have, they're all alums. So I think it's important in the context and we are to keep talking about this. But Mira, this was a fantastic presentation, and I really like the table kitchen component to it. Cool. I really love the embracing of, and I think the ending being a kitchen conversation. I mean, yeah. I think it has a tone, which I think is great.
Thank you to all the friends that showed up. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
This was a lot of fun. Thank you, Mira. Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Bye, guys.
Stay safe. Stay healthy.